Let's work on vocabulary part 2, and I'm going to work really hard to say less often than I did in the first part of the video. I think that I'm really self-conscious in terms of recording myself, so I apologize for the number of ums, and I'll try to reduce them in this portion of this recording. I wanted to talk just a little bit about contextual analysis and teaching children that there are certain sentence structures that give us clues to vocabulary words. And so if you look, I'm going to give you some examples. These are also found in your text. In some cases, the definition of the word is actually provided in this sentence. So for example, think of this sentence. The surplus, that is the amount left over, was so great that the office was full and desks and chairs were lying on the floor. So in that context, surplus is actually defined in the sentence as the amount left over or an amount left over. Sometimes synonyms are used to give us cues to specific vocabulary words. So when Tom went to the parking garage and his car was not there, he was furious. Tom was very mad. So we get the impression that furious means the same as very mad. Sometimes descriptions are provided around a word that give us a clue to that word's meaning. So after taking a spill on her bike, she was able to stand up, get back on the bike, and pedal away of her own volition. We come to understand then that she took a fall, but then she was able to get up, she got back on, she was able to pedal away, and she was able to do that herself. And so that tells me, oh, that's what of her own volition means. Sometimes contrast words are used or opposites. So, for example, the sentence, Kim was lethargic, yet her sister was very energetic. So if the sister's very energetic, but we know that she was the opposite of that, then lethargic must mean without a lot of energy, right? And then the last way that context clues are sometimes used is to give us a comparison. So John was exhausted after the interview, which was more work than mowing grass all day in the neighborhood. So exhausted, the way I would feel if I mowed grass all day, that's how he felt after the interview. So if I mow grass all day, I'm going to be really tired. So he was really tired after his interview. So we can teach students to think about the various ways that authors give us clues to the vocabulary that they're using. I also want you to think about when we talked about morphemic analysis a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about it in terms of decoding, we recognize that sometimes children, if we can break a large word into its component parts, they'll be able to decode it just by being able to decode part of the word. Well, that's also true when it comes to meaning, and we can break words apart in those same ways we do for decoding purposes, but they also give us clues to meaning. And so it's real important that we can do those things at the same time. So remember that we can teach not only to pull off the affixes and look at the root word, but then we can teach how do those affixes change the meaning of words. Evers and Denton did a pretty extensive study looking at a strategy they called inside out, and they taught children that when you're reading along and you come to a word you don't know, first you can just look at the context clues in the neighboring words and sentences, and you can do that using the contextual analysis that we just described. And then you can teach them to look inside the word at the word parts. So what's the prefix, what's the root, what's the suffix? And then to think about what any of those individual parts mean, and keeping that in mind, go back and reread the suffix. Now you have to let kids know that sometimes the rules don't work because syllables that can represent what we call a free morpheme, meaning it's a word that stands on its own, are sometimes used in other words and they don't have the same meaning. So think about the fact that can is a syllable in candy, but it doesn't mean what can, like I can go, means in that context. And so we have to tell them this is not a perfect science. But again, multiple strategies that work. And as I've said over and over in this class, oftentimes for your children who have good vocabularies, who are proficient decoders, they don't need to take things to this level, although it can be helpful to them in expanding their vocabulary. But they may naturally acquire those words as they go, but that may not be the case with your students with more limited vocabularies or who have more difficulties in the area of reading. So in terms of morphemic and structural analysis, teach those compound words, teach kids to break them apart and think about what each word part means. Same with prefixes, suffixes, and roots. And always you're going to introduce the most commonly occurring first, because that's going to have the most power for students. And if you think about it, I bet many of you, when you were preparing to take like the SAT or your ACT, your teachers may have had you looking at roots and affixes, and part of what they were doing was preparing you for the vocabulary sections of those tests. You can also teach words in families, so think about the word cycle. It can be motorcycle, bicycle, tricycle, cyclist, cycling, cycled, right? And teach so that children again have multiple exposures to those same words. You can focus on building a classroom of what I call word detectives and what other experts in the field call word detectors. You can look at word walls, and I know that many of you have those walls. Make sure that you're drawing children's attention to them and that you're reviewing words on those walls. You know, I can pay concentration with compound with word parts and see if I can find parts that match that would make a real word. And if they do, I keep it. And if not, I have to put it back down. Same thing with go fish. I can have affixes and roots. And if I, make a draw and it makes a pair, then I get to set it aside in my hand. Lots of creative things I can do. And always remember that there are those various levels of word knowledge, and that I can go from just having some associative understanding of the word, meaning, I kind of could maybe give a synonym or give a basic definition of that word, versus I really comprehend that word and I can use it. I can categorize words. I can use that word in complete sentences. I can think of multiple ways that that word might be used. And then if I am at the point of generation, I can complete activities and make connections and apply that word in lots of different contexts and know when it is and isn't appropriate to be used. We talked about using Maze and as an assessment of both really fluency and comprehension. Fluency in the sense that Maze is timed. So in order to do well, I have to be reading fairly rapidly and accurately. But also for comprehension, because we know that if I can choose the word that makes sense, that's going to be related to my ability to comprehend that text. Well, close is very similar to Maze. But as you see in a close, and someone asked this, I think it was Karis the other night in class, when I'm doing a close activity, I'm not supplying word choices. Students just have to come up with the appropriate word on their own. So here's an example. A U.S. male brought up on the east coast of the United States, on the east coast of America, stands 18 to 20 inches from another male when in conversation. In talking to a woman, he will increase the distance by about 4 inches. To stand at a distance of about 13 inches usually has a sexual or aggressive connotation. However, in most parts of Latin America, 13 inches is just the right distance when talking to a person. So I'm coming up with the words on my own that would go into those blanks. You can finish that yourself. And then there's some ideas here about scoring closed passages. This is something that you can do yourself. You can take the very passages the students are going to read. You can delete some of those words, and then you can either score it using an exact word method where the student, to get credit, has to give you the exact word that came out of the text. So for instance, if you notice here, when a man brought up in a Latin American environment tries to talk to a blank brought up on the East Coast. So I might say man, I might say woman, I might say person. Well, in an exact word scoring, I would have to use the word that came out of that text, whether it was man, person, or woman, or I could just say as long as the word was appropriate, students would get credit. I tend to use that method more often myself. And then you can see reading level or performance level according to some criteria. And notice that you don't have to get all of the words to be considered fairly proficient or independent. But again, that's another way of measuring vocabulary, which is very difficult to measure. Some things I want you to remember with vocabulary instruction in English learners is it becomes sometimes the most critical, and that is particularly true for children who have already developed their reading skills in their native language. Because many times those children know how to read, and they may read phonetically. We talked the other night about sometimes students will be word callers in the sense that They sound like they're reading and they're reading very well, but again, they may not be processing what that text means, and often that can be related to not having access to that vocabulary. So we know that most children develop vocabulary in one of three ways. They listen to conversations and have conversations with adults. Why adults? Well, because adults have richer vocabulary than children do, or they tend to. And so, in order to enrich my vocabulary, I'm going to spend my time engaging in or listening to conversation with those who have a richer vocabulary than I do. They listen to adults read to them, or they read extensively on their own. And I know that I myself was a student who escaped to books, and one of the few ways that we could stay up late when we were kids is if we were reading, not if we were watching television. And so I relied a lot on reading for entertainment, and I know that that had an influence on my vocabulary development. For children who are in the process of acquiring English, they may have be around adults who have extensive vocabularies, but it's not likely that those vocabularies in English are in English. So they're not getting that exposure at home, and their parents may indeed be reading to them, but they may not be reading to them in English. And those children may read on their own, but if they prefer their native language, they may be reading in their native language rather than reading independently in English. And so we have to make sure that we're doing some explicit vocabulary instruction before we introduce the text, and that we're determining what are the most important words for this student to have an understanding and working knowledge of in order to be able to process that text. If you ever looked at the work of Anna Chameau and Michael O'Malley related to the CALA system, one of the things that they said is anytime you're looking at a unit and you're going to teach English learners, you have to go through and understand that they are not going to master all of that vocabulary. And so you have to think about what are the most critical terms for them to know to be able to deal with that text effectively. We need to be aware that students may be able to define a vocabulary term without really understanding its concept. And so even if I pre-teach that term, the student may not be able to really use it and manage it effectively unless they have some hands-on opportunities to use that word, even though they've memorized the dictionary definition or the definition that we provided. And so I think some of those examples I gave you of some of the things Isabel Beck recommends we do with words can be very helpful. And then remembering that explicit instruction of word study should include concepts and word meanings. We should talk about words that have multiple meanings, compound words, synonyms, so we can generate lots of words that mean basically the same thing. We can talk about words that are opposites and play with those. Homonyms, there, and there, two, and two, where you have words that sound alike but they're spelled differently and they mean different things. And by the way, I still find at the university level that I see a lot of students not accurately using THERE and THEIR. Figurative meanings of words, similes, and metaphors, and particularly idioms, are very difficult in a second language. So real important that when you use an idiom, and we all do it all the time, that you take the time to explain to your English learners what that means, and also have them explore some common expressions in their own language that they can share with you, that a literal translation might not be very effective for you. So in providing word-wise instruction, just remember that you always celebrate whatever students bring to that word learning process, that we follow Isabel Beck's guidance about choosing interesting words with mileage, meaning that children can use them frequently. So yes, it's often important to teach vocabulary that is specific to content instruction. So I might have to teach children the word legislature. But that's not likely to be a word they're going to use all the time. So in addition to, teaching that content area vocabulary, I need to focus on vocabulary that they're likely to use frequently, words that they're going to use in their writing, words that they're commonly going to hit in their reading. That we use a student-friendly definition, and that we not only provide exposure to those words in context, but that we also decontextualize those words and pull them out and provide multiple examples and opportunities for students to manipulate those words. that we create follow-up activities that encourage children to use the words repeatedly and really to make them their own, that we work to maintain those words over time. So I mentioned a minute ago, make sure that you go back and review those words on your word wall, because if I write it up there in September and I don't talk about it again until December, the student may be likely to lose that. And then create an environment in school where you're really reinforcing, oh, wow, you're using one of the words we talked about today. Or tell kids, go home and use these 3 words. See if you can use these 3 words in a conversation with your parents tonight. That sort of thing where we're really focusing on emphasizing the use of new vocabulary.